How much do you know about the enslaved ancestors of the famous Jackson family? I'm Andre, and I'm a genealogist who helps people to discover their history. A couple months ago, I was scrolling on social media and I came across this post that was talking about Michael Jackson's paternal great great grandfather. It had all this information on there that was really fascinating. However, I noticed there wasn't information that was cited. There wasn't any person that was credited with providing this information on this post. And being a genealogist who's really interested in family oral history, as well as using the traditional records and being able to substantiate claims, I'm also really interested in DNA. So I wanted to see if I could find out any information about the Jackson family. I did start to do some digging, and I believe I found some records that give us a snapshot of the dispossession that the Jackson family's ancestors who were enslaved had endured, the violence of slavery that they had to live through. And I found stories that the family had passed down, as well as there was some DNA or information that was found in DNA. So I put all this together and I wanted to share what I found. Here's part one of the story of the enslaved ancestors of the Jackson family. Let me tell you about July. This story starts off in what is now known as Clarendon County, South Carolina. On August 28, 1803, a Revolutionary War veteran, James Richburg, sat down and wrote his last will and testament. James wrote, "I give and bequeath to my beloved daughter Mary Gale 3 Negroes, Tenor, July, and Rose." This is the first recorded mentioning of the Jackson family's ancestor July, revealing that he was a slave of James Richburg. James Richburg was a patriot who had believed in the cause of independence from the British Crown. In order to do this, he, just like his peers, had used their status as colonial subjects and compared them to slaves. James and the other patriots used slavery as a basis to understand liberty and justice. Slaves embodying abject blackness provided a basis for these white males to imagine and create the United States of America. To paraphrase Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, slavery's existence crystallized the moral valiance of freedom and liberty. A contemporary of Richburg's was Timothy Ford, who wrote in Charleston, 1794, this: "Liberty is a principle which naturally and spontaneously contrasts with slavery. In no country on earth can the line of distinction ever be marked so boldly. Here there is a standing subject of comparison, which must be ever perfect and ever obvious. The constant example of slavery stimulates a free man to avoid being confounded with the blacks. Slavery, so far from being inconsistent, has in fact a tendency to stimulate and perpetuate the spirit of liberty." For the Patriots, it was not a contradiction to be a slave owner as well as fighting for freedom from the British Crown. Let's be clear. Slavery and the terror of dispossession and violence that slaves endured was the backbone foundation that the United States rested upon and continues to rest upon, as well as all these American concepts of freedom, liberty, justice, and democracy. James Richburg was intimately entrenched in the violence of slavery. His father's 1788 will reveals that James received a slave from his father, whose name was not even listed in the will, becoming one of 12 slaves that James owned at this time. In the 1800 federal census, it reveals that James Richburg had owned 23 slaves by this time. The extent of violence by James Richburg was revealed in 2023 when a Jackson family member, Thomas Jackson III, took a DNA test, and it revealed that James Richburg was the father of July. I do have to give a trigger warning. We need to understand that slavery marked the slave as sexually opened and was thus violable. This is the world that made slavery possible. The sexual violation of July's mother occurred for no other reason, simply for the fact that it could. To quote Patrice Douglas, she writes, "The performance of the violation, the language of the non-injury, and the conceptual frameworks deputized to articulate the matter of what occurred are effectively muted by the disarrayed nature of this violence." A key feature of slavery that we also need to understand is natal alienation. This meant that any biological connection that July had with James Richburg, that connection did not get factored into the equation of what was constituted as family. Slaves did not have access to the rights of succession that an heir would. Subjects within civil society did have access to that, and they could be considered legal kin. The reality of this is seen in the last will and testament of James Richburg. He lists the children that he had with his legal wife as his heirs, and he wished for his property to be divided among them. And this included the slave that he fathered, July. His oldest daughter, Mary, was 17 years old at the time he wrote this. She had been married for about a year and a half, and she had just given birth to a daughter. And her father bequeaths his biological son to her. July was property, not a son, not an heir. James died in January of 1804. By the next month, an inventory and appraisal was done of his property. And after the pots and pans, a stove, were listed his slaves, and here is July's valuation. July was worth $106.25. He was 4 years old at the time. That is roughly today $2,213.54. So now, July's biological half-sister is his new owner. When Mary Richburg had married Josiah Gale prior to this, there was a legal process called coverture. This meant that Mary's legal existence as an individual was suspended underneath marital unity. This meant that her property was underneath him and his control. So when July was her property, Josiah was also the owner of July. In 1816, Josiah and Mary took July and the rest of their property from South Carolina to Amite County, Mississippi. A census was taken that year, and it reveals that Josiah Gale was head of household who owned 18 slaves, one of which was July, who was 16 years old at the time. Another one of these slaves was a young female girl named Jenny. Stay tuned for part 2